President Trump has done a lot recently. He's declassified 4 sections of election security intelligence, which included 220 million American voter files that were acquired by China. 278,000 possible non-citizens are on voter rolls, and he's only had one demand.
Congress must pass the Save America Act. How easy is that to do, unless you want to cheat?
Today I want to give you the full breakdown, what the evidence proves, what it does not prove yet, and the 7 moves the president can lawfully make next. But before we open a single document, I want to put you in a specific position. I want you to imagine yourself in one man's position, not the position of some imaginary person, not an unnamed politician in a constitutional thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you're Donald J. Trump. You spent nearly a decade at the center of the most vicious political conflict in modern American history. You've been investigated. You've been impeached twice. You've been prosecuted. You've been accused of being a threat to the country you were elected to lead. And perhaps most importantly, for this conversation, your name has become permanently connected to the dispute in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. And you know that before you say a single word about election integrity, millions of Americans will have already made up their minds about you. Some will believe that you're right. Some will reject you. Some will say you're still angry about 2020. Some will accuse you of preparing an excuse for the midterms. Some will say that any evidence you release has been selected to serve your own political interests. And you know all of this. You know that nobody in America, especially our politics, carries more baggage into a conversation like this about elections than you do. And then the intelligence starts arriving. Reports, assessments, disagreements between agencies, information about foreign governments acquiring American voter data, warnings about vulnerabilities in electronic election infrastructure, details from investigations that appear to have gone nowhere, data that suggests people who may not be citizens are appearing on voter registration lists across the country. And you don't necessarily have every answer, but you have enough information to believe these questions are real. And now you face a choice. You can remain silent. You can decide that the political cost is simply too high. You can tell yourself that elections are largely administered by the states and that Congress has not acted, and that the system will probably hold. But if you do that, and the vulnerability is later exploited, the same people who criticize you for speaking, they'll ask why the 47th president of the United States knew there was a danger, but he failed to warn the country. Or you can speak. You can declassify what you lawfully can. You can present the information to the public. That is the position President Trump has faced when he addressed the country last night.
Good evening.
And I believe it took integrity and political courage to walk directly into that storm, knowing exactly what people would say about him. But Trump's burden is not the entire story. It's the doorway into it. Because the real issue here is not simply that it took President Trump some courage to disclose this information. The real issue is what the information says about the system we're preparing to use in a few months for our 2026 midterm election. What dangers are we actually facing? What does the evidence prove? What does it not prove? Now that the president has placed these questions before the country, what can he lawfully do about it? Now let's start. And let's start here. The White House organized its election integrity disclosures around 4 major subjects. The first involved vulnerabilities in electronic voting and ballot counting systems. The second involved China's alleged acquisition and exploitation of American voter information. The third involved a voter registration investigation in Michigan. And the fourth involved possible non-citizens appearing on state voter rolls. And one of the biggest mistakes we could make would be to throw all of them into a pile and simply call the entire thing proof that an election was stolen. And that is not what a responsible analysis should do. A vulnerability is not the same as a successful attack. An adversary possessing a capability doesn't prove that they've used it. Access to voter information doesn't prove that someone manufactured or changed votes. An improperly submitted registration form is not automatically a valid or fake illegal ballot. And a possible database match involving someone who is not a citizen does not prove that that person voted. And those distinctions are important. But there's another side of the argument, and it's that the absence of proof that a vulnerability was successfully exploited does not mean the vulnerability remains acceptable. Now imagine that the federal government discovered a hostile country that had acquired detailed information about employees working at, let's just say, a nuclear facility, and their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, work history, security-related info. Would we dismiss that because the data alone didn't prove that that foreign government could or has or is planning to sabotage that nuclear plant? Of course not. We would treat the acquisition of that information as counter intel. We would investigate how it was obtained. We would determine what it could be used for. We would examine whether other systems had been compromised. And we would close the vulnerability before the foreign government had the opportunity to exploit it. And that is how serious institutions manage risk. They don't wait for the catastrophic event and then congratulate themselves for finally possessing proof. They identify the capability, the intent, the access, and the vulnerability before those factors converge into an attack. And folks, that is the proper lens through which these election disclosures should be examined. Now, the electronic systems and the warning, the White House previously classified intelligence, and these assessments concluded that foreign adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea possess the capability to compromise our election infrastructure. It also says centralized election-related repositories, including registration databases, electronic poll books, and official election websites, were viewed as especially vulnerable to exploitation. Now think about those words: capability, vulnerability, possible, exploitation. Does that sound like the same as finding a hostile government successfully changed the result of an election? No, it doesn't. But they're not meaningless phrases. They represent the ingredients of a national security threat. The question is not whether somebody changed a number of votes on election night. A foreign adversary could attack an election in several ways. It could disable a registration database. It could alter or delete registration information. It could create confusion at polling locations. It could compromise poll books. It could interrupt unofficial reporting results. It could access political campaigns. It could release this information. It could spread false data, misleading information, stolen records. It could cause delays severe enough that we would witness public disorder. It could attack confidence, even if it never changed one ballot. And that's why the government distinguishes this between election influence and election interference. Influence is about shaping perceptions, opinions, behaviors. Interference involves efforts to disrupt or degrade our ability to conduct our elections constitutionally. And those things, that's important that you understand those things. The fact that an attack might fail that still doesn't excuse a system that is left exposed. And the president's arguments, they appeared to be that the U.S. has spent years assuring Americans that its systems were secure, but intelligence assessments simultaneously identified areas that hostile governments might be able and capable and willing to compromise. The contradiction has to be resolved. Did officials mean that the system was perfectly secure? Did they mean no successful manipulation had been detected? Did they mean the decentralized nature of American elections reduces the risk of changing a national outcome? Or did they know about serious weaknesses but chose not to disclose them because they feared undermining public confidence? And those are completely different claims, and the public deserves to know which one was actually made. We have to look at the third thing, which is the data, the China data. 220 million American voter files compromised, associated with China. And the White House says that information that was released includes names, addresses, telephone numbers, party preference, and personal information, phone numbers, military service status. And it further alleges that China created a unit to exploit the material, and that intelligence agencies learned portions of the data from multiple states had been purchased, stolen, or hacked. Now, the released records go even further, indicating that China compromised voter rolls in at least 18 states. Now, some voter registration information is legally available to political organizations, researchers, data vendors, and other authorized users. And different states make different categories of voter information available under different rules. So, the fact that China possesses voter information does not by itself demonstrate a hostile action or that China hacked our election or changed votes. And that's legitimate. And there's some major outlets that have noted portions of voter data are publicly or commercially available, and that possession of the data doesn't itself establish manipulation. But that doesn't end the inquiry. It just starts it. What exact information did China obtain? Which records? What was publicly available? What was commercially available? What was commercially acquired? What was stolen? What was hacked? Did the records include restricted fields that ordinary people in the public space couldn't acquire? Were they combined with other breach data? Was the information used for intelligence? Was it used for identification? Did it identify election workers, military personnel, politically active citizens? Was it connected to cyber operations against state systems? Was it connected to influence operations? Did China attempt to use American identity? I mean, did any federal agencies determine that the information had been exploited? Those are the questions that we need to know. Because look, a hostile government doesn't collect information on hundreds of millions of Americans merely just to put together a spreadsheet. Data creates capability. And the more an adversary knows about the identity, the location, the affiliation, the political behavior of every American citizen that they have on that Excel sheet, the more precisely it can target them. It can identify which voters might respond to a message. It can impersonate trusted organizations. It can design phishing operations. It can identify weak jurisdictions. Combine voter information with stolen financial, medical, employment, or telecommunications data. And it can use this information that's authentic to make false communications appear credible. Again, none of that proves a vote was changed, but it makes the question of how the data was obtained, how it was used, and why the intelligence was handled the way it was a legitimate national security inquiry. And the president is right. Now, the Michigan investigation, okay, that's another thing. The White House released the information about this voter registration operation. And according to what they've released, law enforcement officials investigated these allegations, and they were on fraudulent registration applications, including applications allegedly signed in other people's names and registrations involving non-existent people. Now, the White House says the FBI in their investigations believe that these crimes may have occurred, and they have directed that this gets a further investigation. Now, again, registration fraud is not identical to voter fraud. Fraudulent registration in an application doesn't prove that a fraudulent ballot was cast. But fraudulent registrations aren't harmless either. Voter registration is the gateway to the ballot. So when a state accepts a registration, it creates a record that can affect poll books, ballot requests, voter lists, the maintenance of those lists, and the administration of our elections. People were paid according to the number of applications they submitted. If signatures were forged, if fictitious identities were used, then the government has an obligation to determine some things, like who organized it, how many applicants, how many were rejected, how many were accepted. Did anybody accept registration later or cast a ballot after? Was the incidents or was the conduct case by case isolated? Or was it done by canvassers? Was it directed by administrative officials? Was the investigation did it not meet the threshold of prosecution? Did witnesses become unavailable? There's so many questions that we can answer or we can ask. The responsible answer is not to declare that the entire election's fraudulent, though. The responsible answer is also not to bury the investigation, especially because it's just politically uncomfortable. The implications of it are: follow the evidence, determine what happened, prosecute crimes, and publish enough of the investigative history that the public can understand why decisions were made. And that's not happening. Now, the other claim was the 278,000 non-citizens registered to vote in federal elections. Now, there's a one-page DHS summary, and it concentrates more than 250,000 of these registrations were in just 4 states: California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Nevada. The same review separately flags more than 400,000 registrants listed as possibly deceased across 10 states. And within a day of the address, Secretary of Homeland Security, Mark Wayne Mullen, announced a new enforcement measure that's being built on based on this review. Now, the public methodology supporting the 278,000 figure has not yet been fully demonstrated, and there's some criticism, okay? And they're saying that there's some things that could create some false positives. There was a review in Iowa that it kind of illustrates why. An initial list of 2,000 possible non-citizens eventually produced 277 confirmed non-citizens. Of those, only 40 attempted to vote. 5 were caught, rejected. 35 ballots were counted. Now, the example demonstrates why this methodology matters. A person can naturalize after an older government record was created. Names can be duplicated. Dates of birth can be entered incorrectly. Database fields can be unstable. People can be confused with others who have similar identifying information. And a potential match is not the same as a confirmation of an ineligible or illegal vote. But if you notice what the Iowa example also demonstrates, that the final number wasn't 0, and the false positives were removed. Iowa still reported confirmed non-citizens on its registration list, and some had actually voted. And the other thing, 5 illegal ballots were stopped at the door. The safeguards partially worked, but partially is not good enough when the standard is the transfer of sovereign national power. Instilled, chosen by the will of the people. Now, the correct reaction to this isn't hysteria or denial. It's verification. Take every possible match, provide notice, give the individual a fair opportunity to establish a citizenship, use reliable government record, correct these databases that are inaccurate, and remove people proven that are to be ineligible to vote through lawful procedure, and prosecute any intentional illegal voting when the evidence establishes that. Most importantly, the administration should publish their methodology the methodology behind the 278,000 figure. What states were reviewed? What databases were compared? What identifying fields were used? How many matches were based on outdated info? How many individuals were confirmed? How many were confirmed as non-citizens? How many actually voted? Without those answers, the number is alarming, but incomplete. Okay? With those answers, the country can evaluate the scope of the problem based on the evidence rather than political instinct. Now we have to address the strongest objection. See, following the 2020 election, the DOJ and DHS reported that they found no evidence of a foreign government manipulating election results or compromising the integrity of that election. The federal assessment for the 2022 midterms similarly said that no foreign government affiliated activity to change votes, prevent voting, or compromise the infrastructure of our election system. And these conclusions can't simply be ignored because new documents have been released. They must be reconciled with the new claims. And perhaps the earlier assessments were correct with the specific scope of the questions that they asked. Perhaps they were asking whether vote totals were demonstrably changed, while the new disclosures and the concerns, the collection of vulnerability, the targeting, and suppression of intel. Perhaps different agencies possess different information. Maybe there were analytic disagreements that were minimized. Perhaps the newly released documents have been interpreted more aggressively, or perhaps the government and their previous public assurances were broader than the underlying intelligence justified. And that's precisely why an independent review is necessary. We should not be asked to choose between two government slogans. One side says the elections were secure, and the other says we have catastrophic vulnerabilities. We need to see the definition. We need to see the scope. We need to see the evidence. We need to see the dissenting assessments. And we need to see what was known, when it was known, who received it. And the system can be vulnerable without having been successfully compromised. An election can produce an accurate result, even if it has some serious weaknesses. And a prior accurate result does not guarantee that the same vulnerabilities will remain unexploited, untapped forever. All three statements can be true at the same time. Now, before we go any further, you just heard me make an argument, okay, the strongest version of the argument against the president's disclosures on a conservative channel before I answered it. Now, hopefully you understand where I'm coming from here. The respect that I have for the president, the situation that he's in. I'm basing my opinions here from a multifaceted perspective. I know him. He's endorsed me. I understand what he's gone through. Many of you do too. But I also understand, and I want you to understand, the dynamics of this situation we're in. Because the second half of this video is something that is going to face very distinct scrutiny over the next few months by the people that only have the perspective of being against the president no matter what. And that's, what can the president actually do lawfully? And that brings us to the simplest part of the problem, identification. We require people to verify who they are throughout life in America. You need an ID to get on an airplane, financial accounts, state-issued licenses to drive, You have to verify your identity to be eligible to work. Government agencies use documentation to determine eligibility for programs and benefits. We have to establish that we're the person that we are, person that's entitled to perform any activity in question. But when it comes to voting in this country, in federal elections, the country does not operate under one common national identity standard. Now, we need to state this accurately, okay? It's not true that no American has to show identification to vote, because 36 states request or require some form of ID at the polls. 14 states in D.C. supposedly verify identity through other methods, often using signatures or information that's already on file. The real issue here is that America has no uniform federal requirement for proof of citizenship at registration and photo ID when a ballot is cast. Citizenship is often established through an applicant process. Okay? In other words, the person checks a box. Okay? They sign a statement. They affirm. Now, while lying is a crime, the system doesn't have the means and the mechanism to validate the integrity of the claim. There's no evidence or reliable citizenship database that's available before the person is added to the voter rolls. And this is a paradigm that President Trump is challenging. Why should the standard governing the transfer of sovereign political power in the United States be less consistent than the identity standards applied to ordinary, everyday activities? Now, critics, okay, they raise some serious concerns. Some citizens don't possess passports. Birth certificates can be difficult to obtain. Married women may have names that no longer match their birth records. Voters in rural areas or elderly or military or citizens born abroad may have some political barriers, practical barriers. These are real implementation issues, but they're not arguments against verification. They're arguments for designing the verification process correctly. Provide ID without charge. Create a secure process for citizens who lack standard documents. Allow federal and state databases to verify citizenship where reliable records already exist. Give notice and an opportunity to correct errors. Protect citizens from wrongful removal. Punish officials or private actors who intentionally manipulate the process. Security and access don't have to be enemies. We're a competent government. We should be able to verify eligibility while protecting everybody else's qualified right to vote. That's not what we do. Now, go back to being President Trump. Why does this matter? And why does his personal role matter? Because he's attempting to raise this issue while carrying the political consequences of 2020. He knows his opponent, all of them, will not evaluate this evidence in a vacuum. They will evaluate it through everything they've already believed about him. They'll say he's relitigating the past. They'll say he's undermining the next election. They'll say he's trying to protect the Republican majority. They'll say he's abusing intel and vindicating himself. They'll say all those things. You name it, they'll say it. And they'll do it before listening or reading one page of the documents. And that's why I believe this decision, his decision to release the information, required a hell of a lot of courage. Not because a president should receive automatic credit merely for making an allegation. Not because Donald Trump is incapable of wrongdoing. Not because he knew the disclosure would expose him to the exact accusations that have followed him for years. And he chose to disclose it anyway. He appears to believe the danger of silence is greater than the danger of his reputation. I agree. Imagine the competing pressures. If he releases raw intel, he may compromise sources or methods. If he heavily redacts it, critics say that evidence is missing. If he summarizes the conclusion, critics demand the documents. If he releases the documents, critics challenge the interpretation. If he orders investigations, he's accused of political retaliation or hand selecting. If he doesn't investigate, the alleged misconduct goes unresolved. If he pushes legislation, he's accused of suppressing votes. If he accepts the current system, he's risking sending the country into another election without addressing vulnerabilities that his own government has identified. There was no safe path. There was only a decision about which risk he believed his oath required him to accept. But courage in disclosing the problem is only the first step. The question now is, what will President Trump do? What can President Trump do? And I think he has a few options. And the first is continued controlled declass, not a random document dump, not hundreds of pages released without context. The administration should build an evidentiary record, and it should be one that an ordinary American and a skeptical member of Congress can follow. Make a timeline. What did the intel community learn? When? What agencies received the info? What officials were briefed? What judgments did these analysts reach? Where did these agencies disagree? What information was withheld from him or Congress? And what remains classified? Why? I mean, which claims are uncorroborated? The president possesses substantial authority over classified national security information within the executive branch, but responsible disclosure requires protecting intel sources, collecting methods, and protecting the ongoing operations and individual privacy. Therefore, he may have to release some redactions, release declassified analytic judgments, release interagency dissent, release the methodology behind these large numerical claims, provide classified annexes to Congress, and publish an index listing the records that remain withheld and the legal or national security reason for withholding them. We don't need every operational secret, but we do need enough transparency to determine whether the administration's public conclusion fairly represents the underlying evidence. I think it does, but I'm trying to create an unbiased steelman for this, because there are going to be naysayers that need to know, they need to believe, because this is so fundamental, foundational. This is a tenet of our Constitution. And President Trump should require or politically force Congress to confront the full classified record. The House and Senate and Intel committees, the Judiciary committees, the Homeland Security committees. They should all be briefed. Can't allow elected officials to go on TV and declare the evidence conclusive, inconclusive, meaningless, any of that, if they've refused to examine the underlying evidence on record. And it needs to be tracked. Did members receive the documents? Did it establish foreign collection? Did it establish exploitation? Did it establish manipulation? Do members believe there's additional investigation necessary? Now, they can tell the American people after that whether the administration accurately described the general nature of the threat or whether they're perpetuating or embellishing. This distributes the constitutional burden, but it also prevents the issue from remaining a contest between President Trump and cable news commentators. Members of Congress have responsibilities. They may not always take them, but they have them, and force them to exercise them, because this is important. And we have the Senate and the House. Put those leaders under pressure. And the next option, and this could be the most important, is that President Trump should call for a bipartisan National Election Security Review Commission. Not a commission designed to declare him the rightful winner of 2020. Not that he would do that, but I say it. not a commission empowered to select the winners of the midterm. A fact-finding body designed to answer the questions the existing institutions have failed to resolve publicly. Equal numbers of House Republicans and Democrats, an equal number of Senate Republicans and Democrats, state election officials from both parties, some cybersecurity experts, constitutional scholars, former judges, IGs, professionals who understand intelligence collection, professionals who understand voting equipment, databases, audits. They should all have appropriate security clearances, and the commission should have access to the relevant classified and unclassified records. And Congress should provide subpoena authority so that they can compel documents and testimony when necessary. And it should operate under a deadline, not 2 years from now, not after the midterms. They should be required to provide an interim report, widespread, before voting begins, early voting begins. And this commission should have to answer 5 questions. What did foreign governments obtain? What election capabilities did foreign actors possess? Was any vulnerability actually exploited in connection with registration, voting, tabulation, certification? Did government officials suppress, mischaracterize, or compartmentalize any relevant intelligence? And 5, what immediate safeguards need to be implemented before the next federal election? This would not eliminate the disagreement. I don't think anything could, but it would create a process more credible than these competing partisan press conferences. And that is the most important thing, because the process must be capable of surviving the distrust that some of these people have just because of the name Donald Trump. And President Trump doesn't merely demand that people trust him. He's attempting to build a review structure designed to reach credible conclusions, even among people who don't trust him. But we also have to think about this. We have to investigate and prosecute the crimes. And the president can direct the executive branch to prioritize lawful investigations. The FBI and the DOJ, they can investigate foreign cyber intrusions. They can look at potential obstruction of any federal investigation. But this part has to be handled with discipline. The president should not publicly predetermine criminal guilt, which he hasn't. Okay? The DOJ must determine whether the evidence satisfies the elements of identifiable federal offense. Investigators have to preserve the evidence. They have to have witnesses, databases, intent. And prosecutors have to be willing to decline cases that the evidence can't support. And I don't see that as anything other than the rule of law. I mean, the objective is not to produce predetermined number of indictments. We're not trying to bring scalps. The objective is to determine what happened and then impose consequences based on the fact that crimes did or did not exist. And if an intelligence official concealed material intentionally, especially from lawful oversight, needs to be investigated. If registration workers forged applications, investigated. If there were foreign actors hacking into our systems, we need to identify and charge them. If noncitizens knowingly registered to vote, voted, prosecute them under any applicable law. And if these allegations don't withstand investigation, then say that clearly. Because the investigation has to be credible and it has to be capable of confirming or disproving any claims. And then 5 is hardening the midterms. The federal government doesn't administer every election from Washington. States have the primary responsibility. Federal agencies can support them through cybersecurity, through enforcement of federal voting laws, and we can help establish certain national requirements. President Trump should convene with every governor and every chief state elected official. Place the threat assessment in front of them. Tell each official what the intel indicates about the system. Offer the immediate cybersecurity support. Require some attention to every critical vulnerability. Electronic systems should receive testing, penetration testing. Known software weaknesses should be patched. Access should require some pretty strong authentication. Access laws need to be preserved, reviewed. Same with registration databases. They should also be backed up. All these poll books, if they're electronic, have to have some contingency procedures. And paper records should exist wherever technically possible. And the audit capabilities should be demonstrated before Election Day. Foreign cyber incidents should be reported to the national law enforcement apparatus. States should know who to contact as well. DHS, FBI, EAC, CISA, they should be able to do that the moment the activity is detected. And that's what urgency should look like. Shouldn't be panic. Should be preparation. We should be proactive rather than reactive. And the other option, I think, is the one that the president's making the inevitable, which is the Save America Act. Now, you all know the situation with that, okay? The legislation's pretty simple. Establishing proof of citizenship requirements for federal registration and photo ID for casting a federal ballot. But the proposals faced the Senate 60 vote threshold in disagreement for weeks. President Trump should continue fighting for it, but he should also force Congress to vote separately on its essential components. Maybe make the senators vote on free photo ID. Maybe make them vote on citizenship verification. Make them vote on safeguards for citizens who lack conventional documents. Make them vote on identity verification for mail-in ballot applications. Make them vote on secure voter lists maintenance and auditable paper records. Make them vote on mandatory reporting when a foreign actor attempts to access election infrastructure. Maybe not allowing this massive bill to, that contains several disputed issues become an excuse for these folks in the Senate not doing anything about provisions that would command broader support. Full package may be the best policy, but if the Senate continues to refuse to pass it, well, we should isolate each protection and make every senator explain their vote. The other part about it is, these foreign governments. What are we going to do about them? If the evidence establishes that China or any other foreign government unlawfully obtained protected election data, influenced our systems, directed interference operations, then the response cannot end with a domestic press conference. You have to expose the responsible intelligence units, sanction officials and entities, restrict access to American financial systems, expel their intel personnel, pursue indictments, shut down any infrastructure used in these malicious cyber operations. But ultimately, we have to do everything we can to protect Americans whose identification has been compromised. Diplomatic channels can be used to make clear that targeting American election infrastructure will carry some serious consequences, and deterrence requires more than announcing we have a vulnerability and we're fixing it. Our adversaries have entered this on their own accord, and they must believe any exploitation will be detected, attributed, and punished. And I think President Trump is the right man for at the right time for this. But there's also what President Trump can do, cannot do. And perhaps this is sorry, my mustache is a little too long and making me itch. Perhaps this is the most difficult, okay? Because a lot of people just have fast twitch reactions. He should do this, he should do this, he should do that. Not all of that, while maybe a desire, could be true. And it starts off with, can he simply suspend or postpone the midterms? He can't, not his own. See, federal law establishes a congressional election date, and that's the Tuesday following the first Monday in November of every even-numbered year. The 20th Amendment also ends the terms of reps and effective senators at noon on January 3rd. The president can't erase those provisions. Every congressional action attempting to delay elections beyond the expiration of terms would create enormous constitutional complications and potentially leave offices vacant. That means postponement is not this simple constitutional safety valve. It would become a second crisis layered on top of this one we have right now. This is why the situation is so serious. The president can't merely stop the constitutional clock while the government takes years to investigate. The election calendar would continue. Registration deadlines would arrive and ballots would be printed. Early voting would begin. Election day would come, terms expire. So the answer, therefore, is not presidential suspension. The answer is constitutional acceleration. Accelerate the disclosure, accelerate the congressional review, accelerate the investigations, accelerate the state security work, the legislation, the public accounting. The inability to postpone the election lawfully isn't an excuse to ignore the danger. It's the reason the government must move now. Now, what I believe should happen is that within 7 days, the president should provide complete classified briefings to congressional leadership, their relevant committees, governors, and state election officials. I think within the next month, not 2 weeks, actually, the admin should be publishing a comprehensive index of the evidence. I think they already put some stuff out, but again, it has to be comprehensive for everybody. And it doesn't have to be every classified page, but an index. What's there? What's been released? What's still classified? Okay. Why? That's important. Okay. So within 30 days, the admin should publish the methodology behind this 220 million and 278,000 allegation, the records and the non-citizen figure. Because it's important to know which portions are confirmed, which are estimates, and which are still under review. Now, during that same time frame, the federal cybersecurity should complete state-specific threat assessments. Every known critical vulnerability they've learned should be reviewed and have a mitigation plan. Every state should certify whether it possesses auditable paper records or an equivalent independent means of verifying the results. Every registration database should have a secure backup and a recovery procedure. And every state should explain how it verifies identity and citizenship, most importantly. How does it correct any errors? How does it protect those of us who are eligible from being removed wrongfully? And before the widespread early voting, there should be a bipartisan commission, and they should issue an interim report. Again, not a final historical judgment, an immediate risk assessment. We know our leg's going to get broke. We know our leg can get broke. They're offering us a crutch just in case. What do they know? What's disputed? What's been fixed? What makes us vulnerable? What additional actions required? What can we do to mitigate? That's not impossible. What has been missing through all of this is urgency, coordination, and a process that the public can see. Majority of Americans, again, are behind this Save America Act, but for some reason, members of Congress just don't want it to happen. But this is because this is a double-edged sword, because some people will argue that raising these questions so close to an election is dangerous. They'll say that discussing vulnerabilities undermines confidence. They'll warn that any extraordinary action could be used to suppress lawful votes or influence the outcome. They'll argue that Regular elections are the foundation of democracy, and that the government can't destabilize them and can't take away the state's sovereign ability to run their own elections. Now, some of these concerns, even though I'm making fun, some of them, they're not frivolous. But the opposite risk is just as real, maybe even more. Because what happens when government officials possess credible evidence of vulnerability and refuse to discuss it just because public acknowledging that there's a danger may cause an alarm? I mean, it's stupid. What happens when the desire to protect confidence becomes an excuse for withholding information? What happens when a threat isn't addressed because the messenger is politically controversial? Confidence that depends on ignorance is not durable. Real confidence comes from evidence and verification, and transparency, standards, accountability, process capable of correcting and maintaining itself. That's not controversial. I mean, it is a double-edged sword, because if we proceed recklessly, we can damage our Constitution. If we ignore the danger, though, we can allow the constitutional process to be exploited. And the responsibility of government is not to pretend that one edge doesn't exist. It's to navigate between them and do so lawfully. Now, I want to say that President Trump has done something important. He's placed the issue before the American people. He's released information his administration says demonstrates these vulnerabilities. And he never inferred that the documents automatically answer questions, nor did he make indefensible accusations. He created questions that can no longer be responsibly dismissed without any examination. And I believe the willingness to present those questions, knowing how his history could and would be used against him, demonstrates courage. And I don't think his courage is going to end with disclosure. I think it's going to end with action. Because I don't see President Trump sitting this fight out. I think he's going to have to, and I think he will, establish a process that examines all the evidence. Congress is going to have to set aside its instinct to protect political narratives. States are going to have to accept assistance without thinking they're surrendering their constitutional role. Investigators have to follow facts, not desired outcomes. The administration has to show the difference between confirmed findings, analytical judgments, and unsolved allegations. And the country has to establish a uniform verification system that protects election integrity, but it doesn't deny qualified citizens their rights. And all of these have to happen before the constitutional calendar overtakes us. And that is where we are. The question is not simply whether you can trust Donald Trump. The question is whether you trust a system that has not yet fully explained its vulnerabilities. President Trump may know more than the public currently knows. He may possess intelligence that we can't be disclosed of yet. Or the evidence may ultimately provide or prove narrower than some of the current public conclusions. But that uncertainty is exactly why President Trump is releasing this and why this review must happen. Not after the midterms, not years from now. Now, the president has taken the political risk of bringing the evidence forward. Congress has to examine it. The states must act. The intelligence community must account. Courts must resolve. And the American people must demand. Because the United States can't preserve confidence in its elections by refusing to examine the systems on which those elections depend. And we cannot defend a constitutional republic by waiting until after a vulnerability has been catastrophically exploited to admit that it even existed. Trump opened the door. The question now is whether the rest of the government has the courage to walk through it. So here's my question, and I read all the comments, as you probably know from interacting with me. What do you think about this, what I've laid out? I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm just a dude who loves the country. I happen to be a little smart. Maybe. That's debatable. That's up to you. What do you think about these options, though? What do you think should come first? Laid out 7. Give me the number below and tell me what state you're voting from this November, if you want to. And look, if you want the fight, behind the fight, stay tuned. It's not gonna get any easier. This was an enlightening video to make. This was a enticing script to put together. This is my longest video. I don't know what's going to come of it. My channel just started gaining traction. By all accounts, it could tank my channel. But just like President Trump, totally different. But again, principled. Something I think has to happen. So, hopefully you agree. On that note, 56 minutes. This is going to take my computer a long time to render. We have to save America. Absolutely have to. See you soon.